does the size of the project come down as far as hospitality aspect is concerned when you do a mixed use? Obviously, you can't make a hotel as big as if you would just build the hotel, or does it not affect? As in, would you build a smaller hotel in a mixed use project compared to a 400-room hotel in a normal sense?
Frankly, I think both options are there. It depends really on the land parcel that you have. There are very large developments, where mixed use can be a fairly large, substantial. We were looking at, we did a study recently for the redevelopment of the New Delhi railway station, and for a private group out of Korea. And that was a very large format. I mean, there were actually 3 hotels in that space in the redevelopment exercise. So I think it's the need of and the location, the size of the captive area, etc. So I don't think that it is necessarily true that you need to build a small hotel inside a mixed-use development. It can be a large hotel like the Raffles in Singapore, or even the Mandarin Oriental.
But I think, for mixed-use development, you would need a certain amount of threshold size. You can't be working on a 1 acre of land with 3 FSI and be doing a mixed-use development. So, of course, the mixed-use development format becomes prohibitive for small developments. But, of course, going back to infrastructure, of course, Dhruv will be able to probably help me out a bit on this. I mean, of course, we're saying hotels are not classified as infrastructure and the works, but then there is a movement which has happened towards it. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. For instance, if there is, let me just get my numbers correct. It could be, I think, if your capitalization is more than 200 crores on the project, then you actually get classified, irrespective of the star rating, as an infrastructure. And then you can actually look in for longer repayment time periods, which could stretch up to 25 years and beyond. And there is also another, breather which has come into the monetary policy is with regard to the fact that if you are, classified less than 3-star hotel, and if you're in a place where the population is less than 1 million, then you again get classified as infrastructure. So what I must say is it's not as bleak as it seems. There have been certain amount of changes which have started, kind of trickling into the monetary policy. And I think the government also realizes that. I mean, there is no reason that in the next 2 years we should have some kind of a concrete development. So Dhruv, is this correct that these kind of norms really exist?
It's 200 crores other than the cost of land.
Yes, on the capitalized value, yes. Excluding the land.
Which almost excludes everything outside of luxury.
So that's the problem that, maybe the government needs to understand that, a lot more projects need to be covered under this infrastructure segment because it is a booming industry, it provides a lot of employment, and it is necessary to promote it by providing it lower cost of funds. Just to address a couple of other points, in terms of lowering the cost of funds and reducing stress on hotels, it is also very important to, fully analyze how much debt a particular project can take. What we've noticed is that some developers are very aggressive in terms of their assumptions on, say, in a mixed use, in terms of the assumption on sale of service apartments or commercial or retail space, not in terms of just the valuation, but also in terms of the velocity of this sale. So in case, the sales are very sluggish and you're heavily dependent on cash flows from these sale proceeds to complete your project, your execution can get severely hampered. So whenever you're trying to, develop a capital structure and approach lenders and sort of understand how you should be funding your project, these cash flows need to be heavily discounted as well. When you look at, say, a service apartment component of a mixed-use development, it's a very niche market, and there won't be so many people readily willing to sort of invest in a service apartment complex, at least at this point of time where we stand, because we've noticed that a lot of our projects get stuck only because the sales are not as fast as the promoters anticipated, and hence the capital structure is not, there's no financial closure that's achieved as and when it's required. Also, when you come to, longer tenor loans, we've realized that hospitality does have a much larger gestation period. So on an average, all loans that we're sanctioning are a minimum 13 to 14 years, including a significant moratorium, not just for construction, but also 1 to 2 year moratorium for the first 2 years of operations of a hotel, where they need to only service the interest and not the principal. And hence, the moratorium and the ballooning and structuring of the transaction is very important.
I think you're sitting right here on a typical mixed land use usage, at the Leela here, right? You got a luxury hotel, you've got service apartments, you've got entertainment, you've got mall, you've got theaters, and I think it's probably one of the best success stories. I mean, is Michelle around to tell us what the balance sheet looks like? But yeah, I think it's one of the great success stories of typical mixed land use in the middle of a corporate sector.
I actually had a question for Gaurav. When you talked about mezzanine debt, can you elaborate it a bit for us? Because according to me, mezzanine debt comes at a huge cost of cost. And so just from your understanding, how do you actually make it happen? So it's a learning for all of us around here.
Look, cost of capital, unfortunately, India is high, right? Whether you look at debt, comparatively, obviously, right? So per se, mezzanine is not cheap. But what is happening is, in real estate, if you will see, especially in hospitality space, a lot of mezzanine capital has started playing an important role. Why? Because a developer used to historically think in the residential project, you don't need any debt. Why? Because it's a self-liquidating model. You launch the project, the proceeds itself will start giving you capital to build it. But interestingly, what also developers started doing is they started using the proceeds to cross-subsidize other projects, which Mandeep mentioned. So what happened was the capital eventually, and I can use the sale proceeds as source of equity, right? They kind of dried up. And they were forced to now take mezzanine capital. So mezzanine capital only works when you're trying to replace it primarily with equity, right? If you try and replace mezzanine capital with debt, right, it will not stack up. Right, so that's why I said it's not a 60-40 model which will work on debt equity. It is the 40-40-20 model which will work with mezzanine in it, where you are replacing 20% of your equity with mezzanine. Or if that doesn't stack up and that doesn't keep bank comfortable, right, then you can trade off that with bit of debt also, right? But ensure that your overall cost of capital remains the same. Right, so we kind of did that on a different note because we also have a project which is kind of quasi-mixed use. We are primarily focused on hospitality, but in that particular project, we have a bit of retail/commercial component in it. Right, so when we went to bank, and interestingly, Yes Bank is the banker for that particular project, and bank was very comfortable to see, okay, your hotel will take, let's say, about 3 years post-construction to stabilize, right? But your commercial and retail could be up and running within 12 to 18 months of completion. It will be fully stabilized. So one, it was subsidizing the cash flow. At our end, at our balance sheet, what we did was to ensure we are able to keep the equity exposure same. We kind of created a lease structure for that asset, right? And instead of buying it, right, we provided revenue share to the asset owner. So it's not mezz in the conventional sense, but what we did was we reduced our capital exposure in that asset by not buying it and taking it on a long 60-year lease by that owner, right, and using his capital to fund the development eventually.
So typically mezz would come in for a fixed period of time and then exit. It's like a quasi-equity.
Yes, typically mezz would be anything between 3 to 5 years, right? So you can use that once you have started construction, right, till the asset, let's say, reaches stabilization. So in case of hospitality, you would not want to take mezz on day one. You would want to take a mezz when your asset is, let's say, 50 to 60% complete, right, and eventually exit that with a debt once asset is in first or second year or third year of operation.
You don't necessarily need to exit it out in a lot of cases. It depends upon your terms and condition of your mezzanine funding. So you can sometimes convert it into a pure equity of the first class. So if you really want that. But, and a lot of times it happens is that sometimes those mezzanine debt providers see a very good prognosis out of holding their share in the asset for long and then monetizing the asset. So some of them even stay put. So you sometimes can even negotiate on non-exit with them. So you can work both ways. So I guess a lot of times, one has to be slightly more smart than required. People like yourself who've done great amount of work on owning assets and then spreading, because a lot of people are going the asset-light model. So I think, it's quite a learning actually of what you've done in the industry.
I think it's your own individual lookout. Sometimes holding on to somebody as equity in your company for 20% may not necessarily be the best thing because if he doesn't find an exit, he's just going to be sitting there, and I'm not sure how much of value that person is going to add or that entity is going to add. But it really depends on the structure of your organization and what your plans are and what your visions and how much you want to grow outside of that. But what I wanted to ask Dhruv, and I'm not sure how candid you'll be willing to be, is what's the status of your hospitality lending portfolio today?
Because we know how to structure
In excellent health?
it's in very good condition.
Okay.
Because
Like I said,
we have
Because
I'm not sure how candid you will be. But
no, I'm being
Mandeep's statement was that there'd be lots of NPAs in hospitality.
They have good borrowers.
Dhruv has become very quiet after that.
no. We choose borrowers very wisely, is what we would say.
All right. So you don't have any assets which you're currently lending which are up for sale because they're stressed?
Such a huge chunk of our, because we have a very large portfolio, so obviously there would be one or two that would always be in a particular sort of situation, but since it's such a large portfolio and one or two don't really matter, so yeah.
And you continue to look at hospitality aggressively in terms of
So
lending?
I think Yes Bank has the biggest hospitality book
I'm
as
aware
of
of
now. So we are very aggressive on hospitality even now, and I think every year we would do at least, in the north itself, we'll do about 12 to 14, 15 deals at least.
And would there be any preference if you have a mixed use, right, vis-a-vis a standalone hospitality? Is there any bias towards any of them, or they are?
See, it'll completely depend on the location. So if a mixed use makes complete sense in a particular location, we would definitely be swayed by it. But if a particular location demands only a hospitality asset and no other asset class to accompany it, then, why bother with?
So which means from banking perspective, you will evaluate every component separately.
Yes.
And put it together in a mixed-use
Yes,
development.
like I said, we would heavily discount the non-hospitality component of it because, since it's such a long-term loan that we're looking at, we know that the hotel is something that would sort of be generating revenues over a period of time, especially if, the developer is trying to do a strata sale. In case of a lease model, then obviously we would give more importance to the other components as well.
Gaurav, can I ask you a question? With your experience now, 25 hotels and growing, and you've had a lot of various kind of funding, a lot of equity through your investors, and a fair amount of debt. In your experience, now that many of your projects have moved on to operating platforms, what's the debt equity structure that works?
Look, in SAMHI, we have taken a totally different approach, right? Interestingly, because we have raised significant amount of equity capital. So what we did was we had a two-pronged strategy. First, we would go heavy on equity, right? Build our asset and eventually take leverage from a bank, right? When our asset is, as I'm saying, 60% complete. So if we are saying debt equity is 60-40 is what our target is, right? We will go ahead and put as much as 80% of equity upfront and go to a bank and say, look, this project is more than 80% complete, right? We want to lever it up, right? Why don't you give 60-40 leverage on this basis the performance or what you can see rather than just a piece of land, right? And refund our equity, right? That is strategy number one. Sometimes it doesn't work. Bank is still not convinced. There are still archaic regulations in bank which will say we can't refund promoter equity irrespective of where the stage of the project is. So if that doesn't work, then we go with the second strategy whereby we say, okay, let the asset stabilize, right? And once the asset is stable, we again go and refinance that asset, right? So virtually from our perspective, the 14-year tenor doesn't matter. Optically it does, because optically you would want a long-term financing on our asset just in case you hit a poor market cycle and refinancing is not easy. But ideally we would want our loans to be perpetual, whereby we would go every 3 years and 4 years, right, and refinance that particular loan and keep on circulating it. One good thing about hospitality, unlike commercial, is that it adjusts itself to inflation every year. So if the market is improving, right, every year you will get a higher ARR and higher GOP, thus the financeability of that asset is going up every year, right? So that's the strategy that we are adopting right now, that if we are not able to get the leverage that we want upfront, we will go and once the asset is ready, we'll go and refinance it.
And when you go to refinance in a bank, typically the bank is looking at your DCF valuations?
If the yes, eventually bank looks at DCF, and that's again a challenge in a construction finance, because what happens is the bank would say, oh, your asset opens on 1st of January, right? And that year I want to see your debt service coverage ratio of 1.1, 1.5, so on and so forth, which may not happen in reality, right? That's where mixed use come in play, whereby we can say that, okay, the hotel is going to have the J curve, right? But I have other asset classes, right, which will support and eventually give me the debt servicing I'm looking at. Unfortunately, I have not figured out any way around it, right, to go and convince banks that we're going to have a shortfall in the first year. I'll not have a debt servicing in the first year, but still continue financing me for a period of 12, 13, 14 years. So that's something we still struggle. And then our solution that we have is either we go low on leverage, right, or eventually add a component of mixed use to make it look better.
Well, thank you to my panelists.